At last, the matter reached its conclusion that Ghislain would officially take on the management of a territory. With this, he would rise as the young Lord of Perdium, while also being formally recognized as the Lord of Fenris Barony. For someone of his age, it was a staggering accomplishment, claiming not just one or two, but 3 baronies as though it required no great effort at all. Walter, his father, struggled to keep pace with the scale of his son's endless ambition. Still, recognizing that Ghislain was ultimately the heir to Perdium, he saw the wisdom in letting him gain first-hand experience managing a territory. So, he granted Ghislain the rank of Baron, establishing him as Baron of Fenris, henceforth to be known officially as Baron Fenris. When the solemn conferral ceremony was finished, a chorus of elated voices broke out among the gathered Perdium vassals and knights who had witnessed the momentous event. From that instant on, the bond between Walter and Ghislain was no longer just that of father and son. They had transitioned fully into their new roles as lord and vassal. In the days before the formal ceremony, Ghislain had convened with Walter and the vassals of Perdium to lay out his precise plan for claiming Dygald's lands. Ghislain was certain that Amelia would soon gain command of Rayfold, and though the others lacked every specific detail, none dared dismiss his judgment as unreasonable. Ghislain indicated Fenris Barony on the map, explaining how Dygald's 5 baronies had been divided and stating his intent to secure Fenris as the primary base. It stood at the center of the entire territory, offering the best strategic vantage. After explaining his reasoning in patient detail, he turned to the room, asking if there were any lingering questions. He knew all too well that to gain the vassals' approval for claiming Fenris as a reward, he needed to be thorough and beyond reproach. Randolph found himself at a loss for words, fully acknowledging that Ghislain had more than earned the right to make such a request. Even Homern, after quiet consideration, conceded that Ghislain's logic was ironclad. Neither of them could find a way to object. At the same time, Albert leaned in close to Walter, whispering in hushed tones. Though no one could hear the precise words, it was obvious the conversation involved the strained finances of Perdium following the war. As Walter finally spoke, his voice a touch hesitant, explaining that no matter what, someone had to step up to govern Dygald's land properly. In the end, his tone revealed approval of Ghislain's proposal. Acknowledging this, Ghislain bowed respectfully and gave his thanks as the vassal of Perdium. Yet one other issue still hung awkwardly in the air, leaving Walter clearing his throat in mild embarrassment before broaching it. He admitted with a sigh that Perdium had suffered severe financial losses during the conflict and was now desperately tight on funds. Already familiar with his father's way of dancing around unpleasant truths, Ghislain urged him to get straight to the point. At that, Walter suggested they might have to sell the runestones immediately to shore up their coffers. Ghislain answered in a flash, calmly announcing that there were no runestones left to sell. The shock visibly rocked Walter, who repeated the words as if trying to digest them. With a quiet gesture, Ghislain explained that the entire stockpile of runestones, enough to sustain Perdium for a full decade, had been destroyed in the explosive magic during the final battle right before the estate's gates. Every single stone had been obliterated. Silence fell over the entire hall, heavy and suffocating. Ghislain then promised in a steady voice that he would take responsibility and dig up fresh resources to support Perdium going forward. Once that matter was set aside, Perdium held a modest but joyous banquet to celebrate Ghislain's elevation. Among the first to step forward was Belinda, offering sincere congratulations to the newly made Baron. As the last living member of the king who ruled the night in the kingdom, she continued to fulfill her duty of watching over her teacher's son. Belinda encouraged Ghislain to take a seat and enjoy the food. Behind her, Gillian, who had completely recovered from his injuries, stepped forward to offer his congratulations, joking that perhaps he ought to address Ghislain as Lord from now on. Kayer joined in, his boisterous tone carrying easily across the hall, remarking how their leader had advanced to an entirely new level. Belinda's thoughts turned briefly inward, reflecting on how she used to worry so deeply about this young lord. Now that Ghislain had risen as a lord even before inheriting Perdium, she could not help but comment aloud that because she had taken good care of him. Kayer immediately teased her in return, laughing that such smothering was surely why Ghislain had grown up to be so stubborn. Ghislain took these playful jabs with a warm smile, savoring this moment of rare peace. With her heart full of pride, Belinda confessed how overjoyed she was that her young lord had become a proper noble, and with a swift motion, she kicked Kaer square in the abdomen to shut down any further teasing. It was then that a new, clear voice rang out across the banquet hall, capturing Gislin's attention. Elena had arrived, the triumph of Perdium's victory reflected in the renewed brightness of her face. Day by day, her resemblance to their mother grew more vivid. She strode in confidently, pulling along Rachel, Gillian's daughter, who seemed hesitant to join such a large gathering, but appeared fully recovered from the eternal punishment she had once endured. Elena grinned mischievously, poking at Gislin and wondering aloud if this nobleman standing before her could really be the older brother she remembered. She teased him about whether she should start addressing him as Lord now. Gislin quickly reassured her to call him, as she always had. He then turned a kind gaze to Rachel, sharing a few gentle words with her. Seeing Elena and Rachel together brought a sense of relief to him, since his sister had been so lonely for far too long. Though shy and reserved, Rachel greeted him with flawless etiquette, her voice soft but steady as she thanked the one who had saved her life. Gislin offered a small chuckle, telling Rachel not to hesitate to complain if Elena ever got too pushy, remarking that his sister tended to use her fists first before any words when she was angry. Rachel was left utterly speechless by the thought, unable to reply, while Elena flushed red and erupted in embarrassment. As if to confirm Gislin's point, she lunged forward, aiming a playful smack at his chest in protest. Meanwhile, Gislin looked toward Gillian and expressed that Rachel seemed to be recovering well, which prompted Gillian to bow in gratitude, praising Gislin for saving his daughter. At that, Gislin clapped his hands sharply, bringing a halt to the chatter and drawing every pair of eyes in the hall toward him. With a calm but powerful presence, he addressed the gathered mercenaries and vassals. He praised their valiant efforts, acknowledging that none of their victories would have been possible without their courage and loyalty. He then declared that as the newly recognized Lord of Fenris, he would move his command base from Perdium to the heart of the Fenris territory. With that came a greater announcement. He would no longer employ them as mere mercenaries, but instead recruit those willing into a proper standing army. Confusion rippled through the room. Many of the hardened fighters struggled to believe that unruly mercenaries like themselves could transform into proud soldiers under a true lord. Gislin continued, affirming that they had heard correctly. More shock struck as he revealed he intended to train them as knights, granting them access to proper mana cultivation techniques. The room buzzed with disbelief, these men hardly daring to dream of such a possibility. Yet Gislin's voice rang with absolute confidence as he concluded, explaining that their valor on the battlefield had earned them the right to stand as knights. At his side, Belinda leaned close, whispering a practical concern, that transforming this many men into knights would require a truly staggering fortune. Gislin only smiled with breezy calm, stating without hesitation that he would simply have to go out and earn that fortune, no matter what it took. Gislin shifted his attention to Gillian, inquiring whether his injuries had healed completely. With steadfast confidence, Gillian answered that there was no lingering issue to concern himself with. Hearing this, Gislin gave a new command, instructing Gillian to lead their people ahead to Fenris. For a moment, Gillian appeared startled by this order, struggling to grasp why Gislin would not travel there personally. A question hung on his lips, wondering aloud if the young lord intended to be elsewhere. In response, Gislin revealed that before he could take up his responsibilities in Fenris, there was still one other place he needed to visit. He explained that since the war had ended only recently, Fenris was undoubtedly in chaos, and would need a guiding hand until he arrived. He asked Gillian to handle matters there, holding the line and maintaining order until he returned. An uneasy expression crossed Gillian's face. He had lived his entire life as a rough-edged mercenary, one who followed orders rather than issued them, never thinking himself worthy of leading a noble lord's soldiers, let alone stabilizing a barony in its lord's absence. But Gislin cut through Gillian's hesitation with resolute calm. He declared that he had entrusted this mission to Gillian precisely because he was the man Gislin trusted above all others. As Gislin turned to make his departure, he left those final words behind him, carrying their steady weight. Faced with this measure of trust, Gillian, who will be known as the White Lion of Fenris, had no choice but to accept. He lowered his head in a deep bow, pledging to fulfill his lord's will and declare that he would see it done. Gislin then called over Kaer and Belinda, ordering them to accompany him. When they asked where they would be going, Ghislain revealed that their destination lay within the Siren Kingdom, specifically the city of Austin. Belinda's eyes widened at the mention of crossing the kingdom's borders. On the other hand, Kair recognized the city's name instantly, remarking that Austin was notorious for its gambling halls and dens of chance. Their expressions brightened in amusement, convinced that perhaps their young lord meant to reward them all with a brief vacation after the harrowing days of war. Meanwhile, not every part of the Perdium estate shared in the festive calm. Elsewhere, Vanessa, usually quiet and timid, had cornered Alpoi against the wall with an unexpected boldness. He had nowhere to escape as Vanessa declared in an intense tone that she needed to draw out his strength one more time. With such words from her, the scene would have appeared bizarre to any onlooker. Alpoi tried to protest, exasperated and half-panicked, blurting out that she must have lost her mind if she thought he had anything left for her to drain. But Vanessa insisted with stubborn resolve that if she could absorb even a bit more of his mana, then she could cast every single spell swirling through her thoughts. Baffled, Alpoi demanded to know why it absolutely had to be him. Vanessa countered almost innocently, reminding him that the young lord himself had once remarked that Alpoi's role was to act as her magical power reservoir. That memory drove Alpoi into a frustrated rage, but he dared not raise a hand against her after witnessing the terrifying power she had unleashed, burning thousands of Dygald's troops to ashes on the battlefield. In that moment, the door to the chamber swung open, and Ghislain stepped inside, catching sight of the spectacle. Vanessa leaning over Alpoi with determined eyes, while Alpoi's shoulders pressed against the wall in protest. Ghislain merely commented with a casual note in his voice that they seemed rather lively. Alpoi immediately erupted, shouting for Ghislain to put a stop to Vanessa's unreasonable demands to drain his mana again. However, Ghislain paid no mind to Alpoi's frantic cries, instead turning to ask Vanessa how her recovery was progressing. Vanessa answered earnestly that she was well and ready. Ghislain responded with a small, approving smile, raising a hand to gently pat her head, commending her courage and strength during her first taste of war. The gesture, warm and paternal, prompted Vanessa to bow her head, mumbling a quiet gratitude to her young lord for his unwavering support. Alpoi's voice broken again, dripping with sarcasm, saying he was nothing in the war. Ghislain glanced at him, offering a half-hearted compliment, remarking that Alpoi had endured much himself. He stated plainly that watching Alpoi fulfill his role so diligently made him, in a way, rather proud. Still, Alpoi's temper refused to cool. He snapped back with biting words, vowing he would someday repay all of this torment tenfold once he returned to the magic tower. But then Alpoi fell abruptly silent, a sudden awareness dawning that he had come to Perdium without any formal decree or approval. Ghislain understood that he can't let the mage go back to the magic tower. So he told Alpoi that he would be accompanying him on an outing instead, claiming they were going to the magic tower. The next journey took several days of travel before they reached Austin, a city nestled within the Siren Kingdom. Even from afar, the sheer scale of the lighting enchantments illuminating its streets made it clear how many coins poured through this gambling capital every day. Upon arriving, Ghislain wasted no time making his way into a lavish gambling hall known as Kraken Casino. The place overflowed with raucous energy as gamblers chased their fortunes, dice clattered on polished wooden tables, and merchants shouted wagers over the constant din. Kair exhaled deeply, inhaling the familiar sense of sweat, openly declaring how much he missed the unique atmosphere of such a place. Meanwhile, Alpoi's expression twisted into confusion, wondering aloud why they were here instead of heading directly for the magic tower. He had been tricked into following Ghislain. In answer, Ghislain casually tossed a heavy sack of gold coins toward Kair, telling him to take Alpoi to wait somewhere. Kair's eyes widened in gleeful recognition, already anticipating the joy of spending coin at the tables. Kair began counting the coins with the delighted grin of a wolf about to pounce on its prey, while Alpoi scowled suspiciously, fully convinced that Kair planned to gamble with every last coin. Catching the mage's worried look, Kair sneered with a spark of mischief. He clapped a sturdy hand on Alpoi's shoulder and mused aloud that the sheltered young mage had likely never witnessed the true taste of adult life before. This only deepened Alpoi's confusion as he tried to grasp what Kair meant. Kair's grin stretched even wider, promising that this was the kind of unforgettable lesson a grown man should learn at least once. Meanwhile, Belinda remained by Ghislain's side. She assumed from his choice of destination that perhaps the young lord himself intended to try his luck gambling. She noted that with his status, No one would dare to criticize him even if he indulged a bit of recklessness. But Ghislain quickly disabused her of that notion. He explained that he had come here for a reason, to find someone capable of managing his new territory. Apparently, the man he had in mind spent much of his time in the casino, and Ghislain needed to pull him out before he lost his limb. Belinda's brow twitched at the explanation, the idea of searching for a territory administrator in a gambling den making her uneasy. She pressed further, asking why such a crucial role had to be entrusted to someone who could be found in a place like this. Ghislain insisted there was a reason behind it, but declined to offer any more details, promising only that the man was extraordinarily clever and worth the trouble. He revealed the name then, stating simply that he was looking for Claude. Before Belinda could even form another question, someone bellowed Claude's name at the top of their lungs, announcing for everyone to hear that Claude was stirring up trouble once again. A measure of relief flickered across Ghislain's face, realizing he would not have to go hunting for the man after all. In contrast, Belinda's anxiety deepened, hearing the surrounding voices chime in one after another. One gambler scoffed that Claude always won through cheating, nothing more than a slick con man in fine clothes. Another spat out harsh words, claiming Claude loved to boast about how skilled he was, but had never won fairly in his life. Now that someone planned to punish him, the man added cruelly that it served Claude right. One brute pinned Claude down, stretching his arm out across a filthy table, while another thug stood looming over him, wiping a stained blade clean against the inside of his own sleeve. From nearby, another of the men shouted that Claude had been caught red-handed trying to pull tricks and demanded their boss cut off his cheating hand. The gang's leader, a bald-headed ruffian known as Crank, spoke up with a mocking drawl, reminding Claude that he had already warned him not to use his cheap tricks around him. With a heavy sigh, he brandished a set of worn dice in his palm, twisting them between thick fingers. He declared for all to hear that Claude had swapped the dice mid-game, claiming it was painfully obvious. Crank squeezed the dice so hard, crushing it, then spat out that faking dice was a dirty stunt even for a rat like Claude. A rising fury coursed through him as he accused Claude of cheating every time he showed his face in this hall, no matter how many times he had been warned. Claude's face, already battered and bruised from the beating he had taken, contorted with rage and disbelief. Glaring straight into Crank's eyes, he demanded to know what lies he was spewing, swearing that he had never swapped a single die, that he had played straight. He declaring that this must have been a setup from the start, a betrayal from a gang who never had any intention of letting him win. Crank gave a twisted chuckle, tilting his head as if savoring the drama. He told Claude not to play the victim, claiming there was no reason to explain anything to a worm who should have known they would all turn on each other eventually. Claude knew he was no fighter, never had been, and now, cornered with his arms stretched and held down, he had no move left to play. Only hatred shone in his eyes as he burned Crank's face into his memory, promising silently to repay this treachery someday if he lived through it. With no hesitation, the thug poised to swing the blade, raised it high, aiming to sever Claude's arm in one decisive stroke. Claude's heart hammered wildly in his chest, his teeth ground together as he braced for the agony to come, squeezing his eyes shut with no other choice. The harsh whistle of steel rang out, but no pain followed. Confusion flooded Claude's mind, unsure if he had died so quickly he could not feel it. Then a calm, composed voice echoed through the gambling den, remarking in almost pleasant amusement how lively the game looked and asking if he might be allowed to join. A sword appeared between Claude's arm and the descending blade, so immovable and cold that it halted the execution without a single tremor. The arm of the man, swinging the blade, quivered as the impact sent shockwaves through his bones, unable to push through the obstacle. Crank's eyes went wide in shock, the scowl on his face twisting in disbelief. He demanded to know who dared interfere, who had the gall to meddle in his domain. No one would expect a boyish figure, hardly past 20, to stroll into a den of cutthroats and halt an execution with a casual gesture. But Ghislain, standing there with his blade calmly drawn, regarded them all without even a flicker of fear. This confidence was not born of noble titles, but from the absolute strength he possessed. At last, he drew himself up, letting the full dignity of his bearing shine through as he introduced himself with absolute composure. In a firm, resolute tone, he declared his name to the scoundrels before him. Ghislain, Baron of Fenris under the proud banner of the Kingdom of Lithania. Crank found himself momentarily stunned, caught off guard by the sudden interference of a noble from a foreign kingdom. The notion that someone of such standing had appeared solely to disrupt his operation seemed almost absurd, yet undeniably real. Crank's men moved without hesitation, The thug on the right swiftly raised his blade, bringing it down with full force toward Ghislain. Simultaneously, the man on the left, who had been pinning Claude down only moments earlier, unsheathed his own weapon to strike. Almost as if toying with common street thugs, Ghislain reacted with remarkable speed. His sword flashed upward toward the right attacker's neck. At the same time, Belinda pulled a dagger from her side and aimed it unerringly at the man to Ghislain's left. Out of sudden, Crank ordered for them to cease. Crank managed to maintain a composed front. He addressed the nobleman, extending a formal greeting to Baron Ghislain Fenris. Though polite in tone, there was an undertone of reprimand in his words as he implied that a noble guest from a neighboring country ought to avoid stirring trouble in such an establishment. He then followed up his words with an order, telling his subordinates to sheathe their swords. The men, well trained in obeying Crank's commands, complied instantly. Their blades disappeared from sight as they stepped back, under the unflinching gaze of their bald-headed leader. Seeing the situation had cooled, Ghislain mirrored the gesture, sliding his sword back into its sheath. He gave a calm instruction for Belinda to lower her weapon as well. Though she complied, her lips curled in scorn, clearly offended that mere thugs had dared show such insolence in front of her young master. Now that the room had returned to relative peace, Crank asked what business had brought Baron Fenris to a place like this, a gambling den filled with smoke, noise, and unsavory company. Ghislain answered plainly and without hesitation. He had come looking for someone, and the individual he sought was here. With those words, Ghislain turned his gaze downward, his expression softening as he called out to Claude, instructing him to rise. There was no ambiguity in his tone. He had come with the sole purpose of retrieving the young man. His presence in this disreputable place was not by accident or whim, but deliberate. Hearing those words, Claude sat in stunned silence. Only moments ago, he had been dangerously close to losing one of his hands. Now, out of nowhere, a noble stranger had arrived and spoken as if claiming him. As the confrontation settled in the far corner of the room, the rest of the establishment resumed its business as usual. It was now Alpoy's turn at the dice. The challenge was deceptively simple. Roll 3 dice and aim for the lowest total possible. It was a game of chance wrapped in layers of superstition, bluff, and reading the flow of luck. They rattled and danced, drawing the attention of several bystanders before settling into place. He carefully laid one die upon another, revealing the final score. A wave of awe swept over him as he saw the results. He had won, and the final pot was his. Around him, hardened gamblers who had spent countless nights at the table stared in disbelief. He himself could only marvel, eyes wide as the golden gleam of his winnings stacked before him like something out of a dream. The room suddenly erupted in cheers. A rookie had toppled a veteran, and the unlikely victory ignited excitement in every corner. Even the spectators struggled to comprehend Alpoy's extraordinary luck. It was as if fate had momentarily tilted in his favor, bestowing him a once-in-a-lifetime blessing. Kair had been seated nearby, couldn't hide his enthusiasm. He laughed and remarked on their little mage's surprising talent for gambling. With a twinkle in his eye, he jokingly speculated on how much more they could win if this streak continued. His tone was playful, but his amazement was genuine. Internally, however, Alpoy's emotions stirred deeply. Though he maintained a composed appearance, his heart brimmed with excitement. A quiet elation bloomed inside him, fueled by an unexpected comparison. The life he had led in the Magic Tower versus what he was living now. Everything felt so vivid and tangible in this moment. As time seemed to dilate in his mind, he considered how much he had earned in just a short time. It was more than what an entire cohort of mages might make in a full day selling scrolls and casting enchantments. Even the title of mage, which once held prestige, now felt trivial in the face of glittering piles of gold. Suddenly, as if startled by the gravity of his own thoughts, Alpoy placed a hand over his chest. He felt the powerful rhythm of his own heartbeat, pounding with life and thrill. For the first time in his life, his face flushed not with anger, but with sheer exhilaration. His heart raced, echoing the joy coursing through him. That moment marked the beginning, the birth of a new path. Thus began the legend of Alpoy, the dragon killer, rival only to Claude the gambling addict. Alpoy remained seated, trembling faintly, his mind still struggling to absorb the whirlwind of events that had just taken place. It was in this moment of quiet shock that Kair turned his head, drawn by the unmistakable sound of Belinda's voice ringing out across the room with sharp clarity, carrying over the tables for all to hear. Her words were laced with a blend of frustration and disbelief. She confronted Ghislain with an accusing glare, demanding to know if the battered, gambling-obsessed boy slumped on the table was truly the person he had come looking for. Ghislain averted his eyes and, with a sheepish nod and awkward composure, admitted that this pitiful figure was indeed the one he sought. Crank then interjected, offering an apology before stating plainly that such a request could not be granted. He explained that Claude had cheated him during what he described as a sacred and serious game. As such, Claude had to face consequences. Of course, Ghislain knew this story intimately. In the life he had once lived, he had heard Claude speak of this day with bitter tears and quiet rage, swearing vengeance against Crank more than once. But now, standing here once again at the pivotal moment, Ghislain chose to act ignorant of the past and urged the Baldy to explain. It was at this point that a faint grin began to form on Claude's lips, as if a plan had already begun to crystallize in his mind. There was a shift in his posture, a slight ease in his expression, signaling that he had seized upon an idea worth playing out. Then, to the shock of those watching, Claude suddenly dropped to his knee before Ghislain. With trembling sincerity, he addressed him as Baron Fenris and begged for forgiveness. Claude then spoke up, referencing the funds Ghislain had entrusted to him. With a heavy sigh, he confessed that the money was gone, scammed away in a scheme he hadn't seen coming. His voice wavered, filled with shame, as he admitted that he had lost everything. Claude elaborated, explaining that Crank personally oversaw all the dice used in the establishment and that the house was diligent in checking guests' belongings for any illicit tools. He insisted that something strange had occurred, the appearance of tampered dice happening to coincide precisely when he placed his largest bet of the night. Hearing this, Belinda could hardly believe what she was listening to. She turned sharply toward Claude, questioning what absurd story he was trying to spin. She also pointed out that Claude had never even met her young lord before today, demanding to know how he could lie so boldly. Unable to offer an explanation for what had occurred between them in his previous life, Ghislain lifted a hand gently to silence her. The gesture was calm, but authoritative, a signal that he intended to take the lead in resolving the matter from that point on. Though unsure of the full extent of Claude's situation, Ghislain resolved to play along with his claim. Turning his attention to Crank, he declared that Claude's words were indeed true. Whether or not he believed it fully did not matter. The important thing was that Claude not lose a hand tonight. Surprisingly, Crank took Ghislain at his word without hesitation. There was a distant look in his eyes as he mulled over where Claude might have obtained such a sum in the first place. He didn't press the issue aloud, but the question clearly nagged at the back of his mind. Lighting a pipe with practiced ease, Crank mused aloud that while he didn't know how the two had met, he did know one thing. Claude's word was never to be trusted. With a knowing smirk, he remarked that swindlers always had a way of sounding sincere, especially when cornered. Comfortable on his home turf, Crank leaned back slightly and explained that the gaming hall was under the protection of Baron Austin himself. That being the case, he warned, even nobles had limits. Stirring up conflict here could risk more than mere injury. It could ignite an international diplomatic issue. With that said, Crank made his offer. He suggested that they all walk away from the incident as though it had never happened. A peaceful withdrawal, in his mind, would serve everyone involved far better than escalation. He advised Ghislain to back down gracefully while the chance remained. However, Ghislain did not yield. His thought was firm that retreating now would make a mockery of the very journey he had undertaken. He had not crossed borders and braved foreign streets just to abandon the boy. So he replied that it would be no different than allowing himself to be robbed in broad daylight. In response, Crank's lips curled into a smile, not one of amusement, but of calculation. There was something working behind his eyes, as if new possibilities had begun to unfold in his mind. Ghislain moved closer and calmly took a seat beside Claude. He then proposed that they try to find a compromise, pointing out that it seemed both he and Crank were after the same individual. This suggestion piqued Crank's interest immediately, and urging Ghislain to continue with a subtle nod. Ghislain proposed a single wager to decide the matter. One game, he said. If he emerged victorious, he would reclaim both Claude and the money the boy had managed to win. To match the stakes, he placed his own title and the entirety of his wealth on the line. Though seemingly rash, Ghislain was no ordinary noble. Beneath the elegant facade and youthful demeanor, he had once been known as the master of swindlers. To the crowd, however, he appeared nothing more than a pampered young lord throwing his weight around without understanding the dangers of the game he had stepped into. Even Claude, the very con artist who had inadvertently lured Ghislain into this tangled affair, stared in disbelief. He had expected the noble to play along, perhaps with some trickery of his own, but wagering everything? That went far beyond what Claude had anticipated. On the other side, Crank's initial surprise gave way to thinly veiled glee. To him, it felt as though a golden fish had swum straight into his trap, begging to be caught. Yet not everyone shared in the excitement. Belinda's eyes widened with disbelief. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Once again, Ghislain was throwing himself into danger, behaving as though he were still the infamous northern scoundrel from his past life. Claude's voice wavered as he turned to Ghislain, unable to hide his nervous curiosity. He thanked the young noble for siding with him, but couldn't stop himself from asking, why go so far for a con? After all, Claude still didn't know who Ghislain truly was. Rather than answering with words, Ghislain pulled Claude close in a firm but brotherly manner, the same way one might embrace a trusted comrade. With a voice calm and composed, he confessed that he was someone who needed Claude for something larger yet to come. Something in the way he said it struck Claude deeply, and in that instant, he understood that Ghislain was no ordinary fool, but someone who moved with purpose. Having finished chuckling to himself in the background, Crank finally spoke. He declared that it had been a long time since he had encountered a noble with such gall. He readily accepted the wager, enthusiasm rising in his tone as he remarked that no visit to a gambling den was complete without at least one proper match. The tension in the room shifted. The earlier altercation, followed by Alpoy's improbable victory, had already stirred the crowd's interest. But this was something else. A nobleman with no known name challenging the boss of the hall. The room buzzed with energy, every gambler turning an eager eye to the unfolding scene. No one would be bored that night, not with stakes this high. Crank tossed a die onto the table. He explained the simple rules. Each participant would roll one die, and the lowest number would win. Should a tie occur, the match would repeat until a clear winner emerged. The simplicity of the game was meant to mock, and Crank's amusement only deepened as he remarked how nobles these days couldn't handle anything more complicated. Ghislain met the jab with a dull, unimpressed look. His expression said it all. He was bored, unimpressed, and eager to get things moving. With a sharp tone, he told Crank to stop wasting time and begin the game already. The smile faded from Crank's lips, replaced by a calculating gleam. He muttered something about Ghislain's impatience before preparing for the opening move. With a flick of his fingers, Ghislain sent a golden coin flying into the air, its arc catching the light for all to see. As the coin spun, Ghislain calmly called heads while Crank called tails. Moments later, the coin clattered onto the table, tails. The first move would go to Crank. With a sense of ceremony, Crank picked up the die and dropped it into a cup. He rolled his shoulders and flexed his wrists, then began to shake the cup with exaggerated flair. The movement wasn't random. He jerked it left, right, up, and down in a deliberately flamboyant display meant to draw attention. The spectators roared with excitement at the performance. But Belinda offered nothing but a derisive scoff. She muttered under her breath, unimpressed by the fuss over a single die. To her, the theatrics only proved how shallow Crank's tricks were. As expected, Crank didn't intend to play fair. Hidden within the cup was a simple mechanism, barely visible. With a subtle flick, he opened the bottom to switch the die inside the cup with the one hidden within his fingers. Then, with a flourish, he slammed the cup down onto the table, the gesture loud and final. A hush fell across the room as Crank slowly lifted the cup, revealing the die beneath. The face pointing upward showed a single dot, the lowest number possible. For Crank, it was a perfect start, and it set the stage for a contest no one in the hall would forget. The outcome of the game seemed certain. Crank had rolled a perfect one, and the crowd erupted the moment they saw the result. The excitement peaking as the possibility of Ghislain's loss took shape. Amidst the jubilant noise, only Ghislain remained composed, almost detached, as though the rising tension of this high-stakes contest had no effect on him whatsoever. One onlooker let out a loud laugh, commenting how the game had ended before it had even truly begun. Another voice chimed in, questioning what kind of fool would dare challenge someone like Boss Crank in his own domain. To them, it was a foregone conclusion, a lesson being taught in real time. Though Ghislain's face gave nothing away, Belinda's heart pounded with unease. She knew her young master's power, knew full well that if provoked, he could tear this entire den apart without breaking a sweat. But it wasn't strength that concerned her, it was the consequences. A public disgrace here would stain Ghislain's title and reputation beyond repair. Claude could feel anxiety creeping in as well. He was the one who had dragged the nobleman into this mess, even if unintentionally. Still, experience had taught him one thing, that to never underestimate the man who made the bet. Crank snickered to himself. He mocked the situation aloud, saying it was a shame to see such a fine match, and so quickly. The stakes had been raised beautifully, he mused, but it seemed the noble had doomed himself from the start. He continued his taunts until Gislin's cold tone cut through the noise, commanding him to be silent. Picking up the die with slow, deliberate moves, Gislin commented dryly that Crank's mouth far exceeded his stature. There was no anger in his voice, just irritation at the spectacle. Realizing his opponent was not rattled in the slightest, Crank shrugged and fell quiet, addressing Gislin respectfully and inviting him to proceed. Still, in the privacy of his thoughts, Crank smirked with confidence. He was convinced that Gislin was simply bluffing, hiding his nervousness behind a mask of calm. To Crank, it was all too transparent. He watched with smug interest as Gislin examined the die, fully believing that whatever effort the young noble made would be meaningless. After all, the tools of deception were already in play. The special cup with its hidden bottom was positioned just right depending on how it was gripped. A weighted die, crafted to always roll a 1, rested between Crank's fingers, seamlessly swapped during his earlier flourish. His elaborate motions had only served to disguise the sleight of hand, and it was flawless. He had used this trick countless times, and never once had he been caught. To him, the outcome was guaranteed. No matter how many times they rolled, his victory was assured. Gislin, Crank believed, stood no chance. But that belief came from ignorance. Ignorance of who Gislin truly was. Calmly, Gislin began his move. He placed the die inside the cup, holding it in place with practiced ease. With his left hand, he channeled a quiet but potent surge of mana into the rim, sealing the cup with a soft bluish light that pulsed beneath the surface. Though visible to those with magical sensitivity, to the common eyes in the gambling den, it appeared as nothing. Unlike Crank, Gislin made no attempt at performance. There were no exaggerated gestures or elaborate shakes. He simply lowered the cup to the table. Just before revealing the result, he posed a question with casual clarity, confirming that the one who rolled the lowest number would be declared the winner. It was a final check, ensuring Crank could not worm his way out of their agreement. When he lifted the cup, instead of a die, there was only dust where the object should have been. Unfazed, Gislin declared matter-of-factly that he had rolled a 0, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Crank recoiled, his expression twisted in disbelief. What he was seeing shattered every expectation he had ever known in his long and dirty career. Never had someone done something like this. It didn't even seem possible. The audience, once roaring with cheers, now gasped in collective shock. One person shouted that the die had turned to dust. Another cried out, asking if it was truly possible to roll a 0. A third turned to Crank, demanding to know if such a move was even allowed under the rules of the game. At last, Claude allowed himself a smile, as though he had just secured a personal victory by betting on the right man. Meanwhile, Belinda finally exhaled, releasing the tension that had built within her. She had expected nothing less. Gislin always managed to pull something unthinkable to outmaneuver people like Crank. Crank's reaction was immediate. He surged to his feet, shouting that the outcome was impossible. His voice rose with fury as he accused Gislin of cheating. He pointed a finger, emphasizing that such a stunt was disgraceful, especially coming from someone of noble blood. To him, it was unthinkable that a noble would stoop to such trickery. Without hesitation, Gislin reached forward and seized Crank's wrist, the very one concealing the hidden die. Despite the man's large frame and brute strength, he couldn't break free. Gislin's grip, honed through relentless training, held firm and unyielding. With a single twist of his hand, Gislin forced Crank's fingers open, exposing the weighted die concealed within his palm. The object clattered onto the tabletop with a dull sound, drawing every eye in the room. In that moment, the evidence lay bare for all to see that Crank was the one who had tried to rig the game. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, then erupted into shocked exclamations. The onlookers began to connect the dots. This entire time, every game, every roll, it had all been part of a grand deception. Through it all, Gislin remained composed. He calmly recited the words Crank himself had spoken earlier about honor and fairness in the sacred game hall. He made it clear that this betrayal came not from an outsider, but from within, from the very man who had claimed to uphold the sanctity of the game. Realization dawned on Crank. Gislin had known the truth all along. The noble had stepped into the trap with full awareness and unraveled it before everyone's eyes. Humiliated and cornered, Crank reacted the only way he knew how, with violence. In a flash, he reached for his blade, drawing it in a desperate motion. With a feral snarl, he lunged forward, driving the weapon upward toward Gislin's head. But Gislin had no intention of being caught off guard. With a calm sidestep, he avoided the attack entirely, as though the strike had been nothing more than a breeze. The sudden escalation sent a jolt through the room. Belinda instinctively reached for her weapon, while Claude stared wide-eyed, barely comprehending that a blade had just swung through the air. To Belinda, scenes like this had long ceased to surprise her. It was simply part of following Ghislain. But for Claude, it felt surreal, even terrifying. Unshaken, Ghislain stared Crank down and remarked that he would have respected him more if the brute had simply shown his true nature from the beginning. There was no point in pretending to be courteous when everything beneath the surface screamed thug and conman. As if on cue, the two men flanking Crank drew their blades. Desperation crept into their movements. If they could eliminate the noble now, perhaps they could rewrite the narrative and escape the fallout. Feigning ignorance, Crank claimed to have no idea what Ghislain meant, but was already too late. Crank saw no way out, so he barked the command to attack. His subordinates responded instantly. What they failed to realize was that they were no longer in control, not even close. They had stirred a force they couldn't comprehend. Ghislain had been merciful, perhaps overly so, but if pushed further, he could turn this entire establishment to rubble without a second thought. Crank did not hesitate. He gave the order to charge, and his men obeyed without question. The two attackers moved forward swiftly, unaware of the caliber of the opponent they now faced. They had no inkling that their target was someone entirely beyond their expectations. However, Ghislain displayed not a trace of fear. He had come prepared for every possibility and had no intention of retreating. The moment the first man lunged forward with his blade, Ghislain shifted aside, evading the strike with effortless precision. The second attacker followed up, leaping in from the side in quick succession. As the descending blade sliced through the air, Ghislain propelled himself upward, cleanly avoiding both strikes. With agile momentum, he used the shoulders of the two attackers as makeshift footholds and launched himself directly toward Crank in a fluid, audacious movement. Crank flinched. The sight of the young noble flying toward him threw his mind into disarray, but he quickly forced himself to react. He raised his sword in defense, aiming to cut the young noble down before he could land. Yet Ghislain's speed surpassed his expectations. The blade swung through nothing but air. In the blink of an eye, Ghislain had landed gracefully behind Crank, his sword already drawn and its tip pressed lightly against the bald head's exposed neck. Every movement had been executed with breathtaking speed and elegance. Crank stood frozen, paralyzed by the realization that he had been completely outmaneuvered. Beads of sweat formed and ran down his face as the full weight of his defeat settled over him. There had been no time to react, no chance to counter. He had been rendered helpless. Behind them, the two subordinates turned in shock. Their leader, the strongest presence in their entire operation, had been brought to submission in an instant, unable to retaliate even once. In the next heartbeat, the thugs found themselves subdued as well. A dagger was pressed against one man's neck, and a sword pointed at the other's chest. The control over the scene was absolute. If Ghislain had so desired, the entire group could have been dispatched in a single stroke. K.R. and Belinda had arrived, executing their support flawlessly. Against them, common criminals like Crank's men stood no chance. The precision of their maneuver left no room for escape or resistance. With a trace of dry humor, K.R. remarked that these fools should have chosen their target more carefully. It was clear from his tone that he found the situation almost amusing, this pathetic attempt to challenge individuals far beyond their reach. On the other hand, Belinda stayed far calmer as she turned toward Ghislain and asked about their next move, deferring to her young lord for the final decision. Remaining composed, Ghislain addressed Crank that as planned, he wanted to take Claude back, along with the money that he won. The warning behind his words was unmistakable. Despite the blade at his throat, Crank dared to resist. His pride clung to denial, unwilling to yield even under such pressure. But Ghislain did not yield as he passed judgment with finality. Crank, as the man managing Baron Austin's most profitable establishment, had been caught in the act of attempting to defraud a noble from a foreign kingdom. The implications were damning. The ruin of a gambling den stripped of its credibility was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. As Ghislain spoke, his sword shifted slightly, grazing the side of Crank's neck. A thin line of blood appeared. The threat was no longer implied. It was immediate, visceral. Should Crank raise opposition in the future, there would be no discussion, only death. Crank's body stiffened. He could not lift a finger. The sharp sting on his skin was nothing compared to the oppressive force behind the young noble's calm demeanor. Despite the youth of his adversary, The murderous intent radiating from him was clear and overwhelming. It left no room for doubt. For a man like Crank, this den was his entire world. He held no power beyond it, and if word of this transgression ever reached Baron Austin, there would be no salvaging his position. That knowledge struck deep, reinforcing the terror gnawing at his chest. Overwhelmed by the quiet ferocity before him, Crank's resolve crumbled. His shoulders sagged as the last remnants of defiance drained away. He muttered a subdued acknowledgement, indicating his reluctant submission to Gislin's will. He understood now. This young noble was not to be trifled with. With that, the matter was concluded. A faint smile appeared on Gislin's face as he shifted his gaze, searching for Claude and proposing that they leave immediately. But the one he sought, the very center of the conflict, was nowhere to be seen. Claude had vanished the moment the fight had erupted and had not reappeared since. Soon after, Belinda's furious scream echoed throughout the gambling den, cutting through the tension like a blade. She demanded to know if Claude had truly fled. Her voice, sharpened by outrage, was impossible to ignore. Her rage intensified as she voiced her suspicion aloud. Not only had Claude run off, but he had also taken all of Gislin's winnings with him. Kayer added his observation with an ironic tone, suggesting that a gambler on the run would inevitably find his way to another gambling den sooner or later. Belinda's fists clenched, her entire frame trembling as anger surged through her. She proposed sweeping the area, determined to find the man responsible for this insult. Yet Gislin remained composed, his tone level and unshaken. He assured them there was no need to search. He already knew where Claude was going. Somewhere within the streets of Austin Barony, Claude rode swiftly atop a horse, a full sack of gold slung over his shoulder. His expression shifted between tension and relief as he pressed forward toward his destination. Thoughts churned within his mind, recounting how narrowly he had escaped. Amid those thoughts, he pondered the young noble, the strange, unknown figure who had suddenly appeared in his life and come to his aid. It made little sense. What purpose could such a noble have in helping him? The question lingered unanswered. Yet with the weight of gold in his grasp, Claude believed he had achieved what he needed. The ordeal at the gambling hall had served its purpose. With that belief firm in his heart, he muttered an apology under his breath, a quiet message intended for the young noble left behind. The words came from a place of guilt. He hadn't intended to deceive Gislin, but he needed the money too badly to resist. 1 year earlier, in a dilapidated house nestled deep within the remote forests of Austin, a young woman named Anna sat quietly on a cold, hard floor. Veiled and pale, she was both Claude's lover and the daughter of his late teacher. Before her, Claude sat, offering a small stack of gold coins, the spoils he had secured from the gambling den. His voice held pride as he spoke, marveling at how he had mastered the game. He confessed that gambling, contrary to what most believed, wasn't about luck. For him, it was a matter of method, of formula. He claimed that by deciphering patterns, anyone could win. His demeanor had begun to echo that of gambling addicts, obsessed with cracking the system. With continued success, he promised they could finally leave the shadows behind. They could escape this life of hiding. He dared to dream aloud of a life that resembled normalcy. Yet before he could finish, Anna interrupted him. Her voice trembled as she pleaded with him to stop. Though she knew better, her heart still ached. Seeing Claude trapped in this lifestyle wounded her deeply. She knew he had been caught in a chain of events beyond his control, yet it pained her to watch him continue down this path. Her hand trembled as she reached for his, gripping it gently as tears began to fall. She begged him, quietly, earnestly, that it was enough. She acknowledged that she did not hold him responsible for her father's death. Despite what had happened, she knew in her heart that Claude had never intended harm. Her body shook with sorrow, the pain of the past still fresh and raw. Seated across from her, Claude was in no better shape. His face bore bruises and his eyes were hollow with guilt. Her voice struck something within him, and his chest tightened with regret. Claude had been used, manipulated by those in the kingdom who feared the power and influence of his teacher. He had been turned into a pawn. Yet he had taken the burden upon himself. His heart believed that it was his own naivety, his own foolishness, that had brought ruin upon his mentor. Because of that mistake, the man who had once guided him had been branded a traitor. And now, the woman Claude loved bore the same mark. Together, they remained hidden in that broken home, tucked away in the forgotten corners of the mountains. Their lives had been consumed by grief and guilt. Even though Anna never placed the blame fully upon him, Claude could not forgive himself. And despite the weight of it all, he could not abandon her. Knowing what she had lost, knowing the name she now carried, he refused to leave her behind in a world that had turned cruel and cold. The hardship endured by the pair reached a breaking point when Baron Austin learned of Anna's presence. Her lineage as the daughter of a professor from Siren Royal Academy, a figure tied to the Revolutionary Army, caught his attention. That connection alone was enough to draw the ire of the Baron. Acting swiftly, Baron Austin ordered her capture, enlisting the aid of Crank and his men. Together, they managed to seize her, binding her tightly before Claude's eyes. In the moment of helplessness, Claude could do nothing. Though his intellect surpassed that of most within the kingdom, he lacked the strength to fight back. Against the brute force that the Baron had brought along, there was nothing he could do but watch in anguish as Anna was dragged away. The weight of his own failures pressed heavily on him. He already bore the guilt of his teacher's death. Now, powerless to stop the capture of the one person he cherished most, the pain in his heart deepened beyond measure. Baron Austin then turned his cold gaze upon him, inquiring if his name was indeed Claude. With Anna now in his custody, the Baron issued an ultimatum. Within a year, Claude was to gather and deliver 2,000 gold coins. The tone of his voice, though veiled, suggested the possibility of mercy, a potential pardon for the daughter of a traitor, should Claude succeed. Austin clarified that a girl like Anna, under normal circumstances, would be sentenced to death without question. However, should Claude pay the ransom, she would be spared. That declaration sealed Claude's fate. It became the driving force behind his every action from that day forward. Left with no path to honest employment due to his affiliation with a condemned man, Claude had no choice but to turn to gambling. As a branded outcast, no one would hire him, and the world offered no legitimate means of income. Thus, he risked everything on games of chance. Now, with Gislin's winnings in his possession, a new spark of hope lit in his eyes. For the first time, he believed he might actually meet the Baron's demands. With newfound resolve, he directed his path toward Baron Austin's estate, determined to pay the price and reclaim Anna's freedom. Elsewhere within the sprawling manor of the Austin estate, the Baron remained unaware that his gambling den, one of his most reliable sources of revenue, had been compromised. Instead, his attention was focused on a different concern. Reports had arrived concerning the prison camp where hostages were held, their only purpose being to extract ransom money from their desperate loved ones. With disdain in his voice, Baron Austin complained about the prisoners' uselessness. He remarked that they did nothing but consume food, offering nothing in return. Speaking to his aide without a hint of empathy, he proposed that if no ransom could be obtained, then there was no longer any reason to keep them alive. Without hesitation, he ordered one of his knights to execute any hostage who failed to deliver payment within the next 7 days. The knight affirmed the command without protest, prepared to carry it out exactly as instructed. Then, almost casually, the knight mentioned that it had nearly been a full year since a particular incident. The Baron paused, lifting his gaze. It took only a moment before realization struck him. He muttered aloud, recalling the case involving the traitor's daughter, Anna. He then asked whether there had been any updates regarding Claude, whom he referred to dismissively as mere brat. The knight delivered his report. Rumors indicated that Claude had repeatedly failed to earn enough money at the gambling hall, falling short of the target. Upon hearing this, the Baron concluded that Crank must have done a decent job in handling Claude's efforts to raise funds. Austin entertained the idea, albeit briefly, that Anna might make a suitable maid, but the thought quickly soured. Her status as the daughter of a kingdom traitor made the proposition far too risky. With that in mind, he ordered her execution. Furthermore, he instructed the knight to ensure that no word of this reached Claude. The knight raised a final question. What should be done if Claude did, in fact, arrive with the ransom? Austin responded with a twisted smirk. If the boy came with the money, then they would simply take it and eliminate him in secret. After all, who would care if a gambler vanished? The cruel grin widened on the Baron's gluttonous face as he mulled over the thought. Such an outcome, of course, depended entirely on whether Claude actually managed to return with the money in the first place. At that very moment, the heavy door to the Baron's office creaked open. Another knight stepped inside, bearing fresh news. Naturally, Baron Austin did not receive the news favorably. His displeasure was immediate, prompting the reporting knight to first beg pardon before delivering his message. According to the knight, a man named Claude was currently creating a disturbance at the main gate, loudly proclaiming that he had come to pay the ransom. Within moments, Claude was permitted entry into the estate. Without hesitation, he placed a heavy bag of gold onto the table before the Baron. With steady resolve, he declared that the sum of 2,000 gold coins, the exact amount demanded, had been delivered to fulfill Anna's ransom. Yet, even after enduring an entire year of relentless hardship, Claude had failed to grasp the cruel truth. It was Baron Austin himself who had orchestrated the suffering he endured. The same man who had ordered the ransom was the one who ensured Claude's every attempt to succeed at the gambling den would fail. Despite this, Claude now stood in front of the man responsible, earnestly requesting the release of Anna in return for the gold. Baron Austin remained composed as he took his time examining the contents of the bag. Each coin was checked for authenticity, even though the outcome had already been decided. That Claude had gathered such a fortune, despite Crank's efforts to deceive and obstruct him at every turn, was a testament to something that should have been impossible. The Baron's thoughts churned as he weighed the gold in his hand. With Crank deliberately sabotaging Claude's chances of success, how could this boy have come up with such a sum? Suspicion clouded his expression. He turned to Claude and inquired bluntly, where had this money truly come from? Claude, unaware of the trap tightening around him, responded honestly. He had won it through a bet. His words carried no hint of deceit. But Baron Austin knew better. Claude had only ever been permitted minor victories, enough to keep him hoping. Whenever he dared to make a large wager, Crank ensured the outcome was rigged against him. There had never been a chance for such a significant win. The answer only served to deepen Austin's distrust. Without warning, he issued an order to one of his knights. Claude was to be arrested immediately. The decision was swift and final. Both Claude and Anna would be executed. The ransom had been received, and thus the pair were of no further use. Claude's expression collapsed into stunned confusion. For him, none of it made sense since the gold had been paid in full. The terms had been followed, and his mind raced in desperation. He tried to make sense of why the noble would turn against him, despite of everything. Before he could collect his thoughts, two soldiers stormed forward and seized him by the arms. Claude struggled, but he was no warrior. His life had been spent studying and surviving, not fighting. Overpowered instantly, he was given no opportunity to resist. His voice rose in protest. He called out to the cursed Baron, demanding an answer. He reminded him that the ransom had been met, and every coin accounted for. Why then was he being thrown into a cell? Baron Austin, now watching with thinly veiled contempt, dismissed the accusations. He claimed that the origin of the money was suspicious and needed to be investigated. He stated he would confirm the truth with Crank before any decisions were made. With cold indifference, he told Claude that if he wished to avoid execution, he had best go quietly. There would be no second chances. Claude's heart pounded with fury. Inwardly, he cursed the reality that permitted nobles to abuse their power so thoroughly. No one stood against them. No one protected those beneath them. And now, he was just another pawn being discarded. As he was dragged away, Baron Austin remarked aloud on his disbelief. That Claude, of all people, had managed to amass such wealth, even while being cheated, was something he had never expected. His curiosity turned to unease. There should have been no way for Claude to win against Crank's manipulation. Claude, fueled by rising rage, screamed with all the strength in his lungs, calling out Austin by name and denouncing the scheme that had ruined his life. His voice echoed through the chamber, full of righteous anger. Then, as if summoned by that very cry, two blindingly swift strikes came without warning. The soldiers restraining Claude never saw it coming. One moment they held him fast. The next, they were collapsing to the ground, completely incapacitated. The attacks were so sudden, so seamless, that neither man even registered what had happened before hitting the floor. Their forms lay motionless, struck down by an unseen hand. The room froze in stunned silence. Baron Austin and his personal knight both flinched in unison, caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. It was inconceivable to them that someone had managed to infiltrate the estate without triggering any alarms, especially considering the strict security measures in place. The unexpected breach left them momentarily speechless. For Claude, the fury that had overtaken him just moments earlier vanished completely, replaced by utter confusion. His thoughts scattered in disbelief. A hand came to rest on his shoulder, halting his spiraling thoughts. The sheer rapidity of a shift in events stunned him. Only minutes ago, he had stood at the brink of imprisonment, facing an uncertain fate. A moment before that, He had risked everything in pursuit of Anna's freedom. And now, once again, the enigmatic noble who had aided him at the gambling den had appeared seemingly out of thin air to rescue him once more. Ghislain stepped forward with poise, moving past Claude without hesitation. In passing, he offered Claude a few simple words of affirmation, commending him for his effort. Without breaking stride, Ghislain proceeded directly toward Baron Austin, offering a courteous but unmistakably noble greeting. His tone carried the confident elegance of someone accustomed to authority. In contrast, Baron Austin was already spiraling into a state of panic, demanding to know the identity of the young man who had suddenly taken control of the room. In response, Ghislain merely snapped his fingers. At that signal, K.R. and Belinda entered the chamber, escorting a restrained and beaten Crank between them. The balding man was tied securely and showed clear signs of having been subdued with force. Belinda marched forward, forcing Crank to his knees before the two nobles. Her tone left no room for argument, and Crank offered no resistance. Baron Austin's disbelief deepened as he stared at the scene unfolding before him. His trusted subordinate, the man responsible for managing the gambling hall and executing his more underhanded dealings, now knelt like a common criminal at the feet of an unknown noble. The sheer audacity of the event shattered the Baron's composure. As Belinda secured Crank, K.R. calmly retrieved a chair and placed it directly in front of the Baron's desk. Without hesitation, Ghislain sat down and leaned back, propping his legs up on the desk with the casual arrogance of a young noble used to getting his way. From this relaxed position, Ghislain extended an offer of conversation, suggesting with a dry tone that they might as well have tea while discussing matters. The posture, the attitude, and the setting were all deliberately theatrical, but behind the theatricality lay a real and present threat. Ghislain was no ordinary fallen noble in his past life. His presence alone carried the weight of authority that could unsettle even the most powerful within the Lithania kingdom. He was a force whose influence, if fully unleashed, could destabilize an entire region, let alone a small, corrupt barony hidden within a minor kingdom.